Hello, children, once again, and welcome to part 2 of the Unsolved Serial Killer and Mass Murderer Iceberg. This will cover the next 3 tiers, and something I've started to notice is that I may have to start shortening down on the tiers, not only so that it'll be a better workflow, but also because the videos may come out sooner. And also because, well, you'll see later, particularly, but the tiers are starting to get pretty dense. Like, in the first few tiers, it was like 10, and now they're getting to like 15 to 20 per tier. And I've seen at the bottom, it's like 50 or 30 per tier. So I may have to start doing one at a time soon. And also because college is starting up again soon, so I'm going to have to go, do that. So I may have less time to work on videos in that sense, because I also got to balance this and other things, like friends, women, the thing in the basement, just things we all have to worry about every day. Well, when you're working on videos this big and this time consuming, it kind of throws a wrench in all those plans. So I may have to slow down in that sense, but also making sure that these videos will get out consistently. So either way, let's get underway with it. And we'll be starting off with the 4th tier, or the start of the lower half. The Robeson Family Murders. The Robeson family murders, also known as the Goodhart murders, refer to a mass murder which occurred in the secluded resort area of Goodhart, Michigan on June 25th of 1968. Victims were a vacationing upper-middle-class family from Lothrop Village who were shot and killed inside their Lake Michigan Holiday College, with 2 of the descendants also being bludgeoned with a claw hammer prior to their death. Their bodies remained undiscovered until July 22nd, almost an entire month after they were all murdered. To be more specific, the weapons used were a .22 caliber AR-7 semi-automatic rifle and a .25 caliber Beretta semi-automatic handgun. The family head, Richard Chard Robinson Sr., was reclining in his chair when 5 rounds from the automatic rifle were shot into him through the window, all 5 hitting their target and completely incapacitating him. The assailant would then enter through the house through the back door and kill everyone else with any of the weapons that he had brought with them. 2 of the children, Richard Jr. and Gary Robinson, were noted as having ran into the closet to try to grab their family rifle, but were shot down while they were doing so. Before the killer left, he had struck Richard Sr. and Susan, the family mother, repeatedly with a claw hammer before he had executed both of them with a pistol. He then put a blanket over Shirley Robison's body and then turned the heater onto the cabin, attempting to cover bullet holes in the windows with cardboard and closed almost every curtain. He then would went out through the back door and left a message on the door saying, "Be back by 7 to 10, Robison." At the crime scene, nothing of value was stolen besides Shirley Robison's wedding ring, and she was found nude from the waist down, but there was no evidence of sexual assault being present. Which leads to no other conclusion than it was used as a red herring to mislead investigators. After a massive effort from police, they managed to find a suspect by the name of Joseph Raymond Scalaro III, who was one of Richard Robison's senior employees at his company. Scalaro was a veteran of the United States Army Security Agency and was a graduate at Harvard. He worked for Robison's advertising companies since late 1965, holding a senior position. He was known to have visited the Robison's cottage at least once prior to the murders being committed, which, to be fair, was pretty suspicious. It is also known that Richard Robison was investigating possible embezzlement at his company by Scalaro prior to his death. Prosecutors, however, had insufficient physical evidence until 1974, when the case was reopened and enough evidence was apparently found to lead to his indictment. Due to this, Scalaro ended up taking his own life and is considered the main culprit by most parties, but his exact innocence remains in the balance and the case is still open to this day. The Monster of Florence. The Monster of Florence, or in Italian, Mostro di Monstro di Firenze, is the name commonly used by the Italian media for a non-definitively identified serial killer active within the metropolitan city of Florence between 1968 and 1985. The monster murdered 16 victims, usually young couples, secluded in areas of intimacy in wooded areas during new moons. The first murder was of Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locchi in 1968, who were both shot to death with a .22 caliber handgun west of Florence while in their car. Loki's son, Natalino Mele, sat unaffected in the back seat with no injuries and found his mother dead the next morning. Loki had been having an affair with Bianco, and her husband, Stefano Mele, was arrested for the murders and sentenced to 6 months in prison. Despite this, another murder was committed in the same way while he was still in jail with the same method and weapon. Other lovers of Loki were suspected and arrested, but again, all were set free due to the other murders being committed whilst they were under arrest. This would be the main method of the killings, with a couple being alone in their car in a secluded area, and they were shot and left to be found the next day, or sooner. Often, he would mutilate the female victims, usually in a sexual way, like cutting out their pubic hair regions and mutilating them in other private ways. Another interesting fact is that there is a 6-year gap between the killings, specifically between 1968 and 74, and another gap between 74 and 1981, which is pretty strange since after 1981, the killings became particularly dense in time. In fact, it wasn't until 1981 that they thought the killings were at all connected. With the use of computer analysis and on his tips, a new suspect, Pietro Pacchiani, was found. Pacchiani had been convicted both for rape and domestic abuse for his 2 daughters, and for the 1951 murder of a man who had relations with his ex-girlfriend, for which he had served 13 years in prison. Inspector Ruggero Peruggioni found incriminating evidence such as similarities between the 1951 murder and the monster killings, as well as reproduction of Primavera by Botticelli, and another painting thought to be by Pacchiani. The only physical evidence against Pacchiani was an unfired bullet of the same brand as the monsters found in Pacchiani's garden at the end of the lengthy search, which was later discovered to have been planted by the police in order to incriminate him. Which, I don't know if you're a cop or you're in law or something if you're watching this video, but you shouldn't do that. In 1994, he was put on trial and the prosecution ended up taking his side, saying that the evidence was falsely placed and citing very poor police work from investigators. He would end up dying in 1997 before another trial could begin in 2001. In 2001, Guittari, now Chief Inspector of the Police Unit GEDES, Gruppo Investigativo Delitti Seriali, Investigative Group for Serial Killers, announced that the crimes were connected to a satanic cult allegedly active in the Florence area. Lotti had spoken to a doctor who had hired Pacchiani to commit the crimes and collect the genitalia of the women for use in satanic rituals. Other than that, this simple case of serial killings is a fine example of yet another case that is absolutely bonkers due to how many times it seems to go one way simply, but completely flips itself on its own head. The New Bedford Highway Killer. The New Bedford Highway Killer is an unidentified serial killer responsible for the deaths of at least 9 women and the disappearances of 2 additional women in New Bedford, Massachusetts, between 1988 and 1989. All victims were drug addicts or sex workers, and he is also suspected of assaulting other women. While the victims were all from New Bedford, their corpses were all found in the surrounding areas like Freetown and Westport along Route 140, a cross-state highway connecting towns in the area. The first main suspect was Anthony DeGrazia, who was a 26-year-old construction worker who was recognized by one of the previously mentioned assault victims and was brought before a grand jury but never indicted. After questioning a previous victim, the police got a warrant for DeGrazia's rearrest, and him and his legal team surrendered to the court, and he was formally charged with 17 rapes and assaults, but no murders. After a long, strenuous story of appeals, lies, and bails, DeGrazia was released in 1990. But he was again rearrested for apparently threatening the district attorney at the time for wrongful persecution and imprisonment. He was found dead at his ex-girlfriend's house, with the death being ruled a homicide by police, but a suicide by the district attorney. I'll let you interpret that how you will. The Brabant Killers. The Brabant Killers are a group of unidentified criminals responsible for a series of violent attacks that mainly occurred in the Belgian province of Brabant between 1989 and 1985. They mainly operated in Brabant, but they did do some other attacks in other provinces, like East Flanders and Namur. There's also one occasion of an attack in the town of Maubeuge, France. The group consisted of 3 core members with other swing members that may or may not have been one-time additions. The 3 core members were nicknamed Le Géant, a tall man who was the leader, Latour, the one who did most of the shooting and the killing, and Le Vieux, the old man who drove. They used a variety of weapons, such as riot guns, which could have been either a Spaz 12 or a Winchester 1200, a MAC-10 submachine gun, and a MP5 SD5 automatic pistol. They would often drive through an area and attack supermarkets and largely low-scale robberies that were often escalated into full-scale massacres for seemingly no reason other than ego. Their crimes themselves were very professional, with escape routes seemingly being planned ahead of time and knowledge of police presence and routes. The motive itself is shrouded in mystery, but it is claimed to have been far-right extremism in the area. They killed a total of 28 people over their 3-year tenure and injured 22 more. There's been nobody arrested for this case. The only people to have ever been arrested were the detectives themselves for tampering with evidence in order to get a conviction. After the case ended, a massive and mad search and investigation occurred and yielded no results, and failed in every single aspect. The case has finally been closed after 39 years with no new suspects in June of 2024. The Myojo 56 building fire. The Myojo 56 building fire was a structural fire that began at about 1 o'clock local time on September 1st of 2001 in the Myojo 56 building located in the Kabukicho section of Shinjuku, Tokyo, Japan. The fire is the 5th deadliest in post-World War II Japanese history and burned for a surprising 5 hours before it could have been extinguished, and sadly ended up taking the lives of 44 and injured just 3 people. It is believed to have been a result of arson, yet that has yet to be claimed. The fire itself started on the 3rd floor of the building, where 28 employees were on the 4th floor and 19 on the 3rd floor. As the fire got out of control, 3 employees jumped from the building and survived the fall due to near immediately being treated by medical personnel. Those who made it to the roof were rescued as well. The case was extensively covered until 10 days after, when the September 11th attack occurred, where media coverage swapped to that instead and the case was solely forgotten. The coverage that did occur was of the investigation into the owners of the building for negligence or possible involvement from the Yakuza. The police noted that the building violated Japan's fire code in several areas, like the fact it had blocked doors and stairwells. If the fire doors weren't blocked from opening, the gases could have left the building and people could have left through them, and 6 people total were arrested for negligence, but only 5 were convicted and sentenced, with the 6th being acquitted. Those charged included 2 executives of the Myojo Kosen Group, who owned the building and the commercial tenants of the building, which housed a mahjong parlor, which police quoted to be an illegal gambling den, and allegedly had owed the mob an insane amount of protection money. This leads to 2 main possibilities. It either is a case of criminal negligence or a case of payback from the mob. The 2011 Waltham triple murder. A triple homicide was committed in Waltham, Massachusetts in the United States on or very near to the evening of September 11th of 2011. In the apartment of Brandon Mess, he, Eric Weissman, and Rafael Taken were all murdered via having their throats slit with enough force to nearly decapitate them all. Their bodies were covered in money and thousands of dollars in marijuana. This made it seem that the killer and owner of the apartments, Brandon Mess, knew each other. Now this is where the case gets interesting. Temurian Zarniev, the deceased Boston Marathon bombing suspect, described Brandon Mess as being his best friend, and Zarniev had animosity over Mess's lifestyle. After the bombings and revelations of Zarniev's personal life, the Waltham murders were re-examined, and cell phone record placed Zarniev and his brother both in the area at the time of the murders being committed. Later, in 2013, Ibrahim Todashev was shot to death by police in Orlando, Florida over assaulting an FBI agent who was interviewing him about the Waltham murders. He claimed that he and Zarniev did so as a drug robbery gone wrong and simply killed the 3 to avoid getting arrested. Nobody has been arrested, and since both main suspects have died since the incident, the case has simply gone cold. The Jeff Davis 8. The Jeff Davis 8, often referred to as the Jennings 8, refers to a series of unsolved murders in Jefferson Davis Parish, Louisiana, between 2005 and 2009. The bodies of 8 women were found in swamps and canals surrounding Jennings, Louisiana. Most of the bodies were found in such a state of decomposition as to make the actual cause of death difficult to determine, though in 2 cases it was found to be that of a slit throat. The investigation itself was ripe with mistakes and missteps. The sheriffs in charge apparently had lost evidence multiple times, which most likely has led to the lack of arrests in the case. The work of a certain author and investigative reporter Ethan Brown revealed connections in the murders to police working in the case, and the fact that the victims apparently had known each other before they had all been killed, and others were even blood relatives. They also shared aspects such as poverty, mental illness, drug abuse, and sex work. Some of them were informants even for the police about the local drug trade, and offered information to the police about the other victims before they ended up joining them. Suspects were few and far between, with a Byron Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon being briefly charged with the second-degree murder of one of the victims. They were released because the crime scene wasn't tested for 15 months after the murder was found. The evidence present was extremely lacking. Another suspect was Frankie Richards, who owned a local strip club and was supposedly a drug dealer. He admitted to being a crack addict and having relations with several of the victims. He was also last seen with one of the victims before they died. 2 female inmates claimed that the sheriff's office had apparently disposed of evidence at his behest. Due to this being insanely suspicious, you'd think they would get him on something, but despite this, he never got charged and was quickly released. This case is an example of possible police corruption and a serial killer or killers who had way too much control of their situation, or, which is the most likely solution, police missteps and police failings. Bible John. Bible John is an unidentified serial killer who is believed to have murdered 3 young women between 1968 and 1969 in Glasgow, Scotland. His method was that he would find women at the Berlin Ballroom, where he would charge them into following him away from the ballroom and to other places, where he would sexually assault them and beat them, killing them off by strangling them to death. The name comes from the fact that he was known to have quoted the Bible extensively and to have even condemned adultery, with his final victim. There is belief that he may also be the serial killer Peter Tobin, who shared his method and movements. Although after Tobin's conviction in the late 2000s, he was dropped as a suspect in the case. Before he had killed the second victim, Bible John was allegedly seen by several people with her. He was described as a young and sharply dressed and styled man, clean-shaven and slim. He was tall and spoke with a distinctive Glaswegian accent. Since the killings ended, more than 100 detectives and 50,000 witnesses have come to work on the case, and almost 5,000 people were questioned. Jean Langford, one of the victim's sister, went to 300 identity inquiries, and she ended up identifying nobody as the killer. The police were extremely afraid of new killings occurring, so they ended up sending undercover officers to mingle into the crowd at dance halls in Glasgow. After the massive manhunt, there was no more killings, and police theorized that either Bible John had died, was arrested separately, or had fled town since the police presence after the third killing was monumental, and thus the case has gone cold. But despite this, composite drawings were sent to all British Army, Navy, and Air Force bases across the UK, Europe, and Middle and Far East. But this, of course, failed to procure a single lead for the case, and that leads us to where we are right now. The AMIA bombing. The AMIA bombing occurred on the 18th of July 1994 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and targeted the Asociación Mutual Israelita Argentina, a Jewish community center. This Jewish community center was the largest in South America, homing nearly 200,000 at the time. This attack appeared to have been a suicide attack, with a bomb-laden van being driven into the AMIA building and detonating, killing a total of 85 people and injuring almost 300 others. To this date, it has remained the deadliest terrorist attack in Argentine history. In 2004, all suspects were immediately dropped, and the attack's handling by the justice system has been accused of being a cover-up. The judge which looked over the case, Juan Jose Galeno, was impeached in 2005 and removed from his post due to a charge of his mishandling of the investigation. 2006, the Argentinian press accused the Iranian government of directing the bombing and a Lebanese Islamist or immigrant group, Hezbollah, for carrying it out. The motive was allegedly that the Argentinian government had suspended a nuclear technological transfer to Tehran. This had been disputed due to the glaring fact that the deal was never terminated, and the deal ended up ending in 1984 with full cooperation and agreement from both sides of the coin. Very recently, in 2024, the Argentinian officials declared that Iran was responsible for the bombing and that Hezbollah carried it out. They also ended up describing Iran as a terrorist state. The Springfield Three. The Springfield Three refers to an unsolved missing trio from Springfield, Missouri, where Suzanne Streeter, Stacy McCall, and Streeter's mother, Cheryl Levitt, went missing from Levitt's home in 1992. All of their personal belongings and effects ended up being left behind, and there was no sign of a struggle besides a broken porch-like globe, which didn't really make any sense in the investigation. There was also a message left behind on the phone's answering machine, which police believed was a clue to the disappearances, but it was accidentally deleted by investigators. That would be where it would stop, at least until 1997, when a Robert Craig Cox, who was a convicted kidnapper and robber, claimed to know where they were and that they would have been murders and would never ever be found. He had no relations to the case, despite the fact that he was in Springfield at the time and his criminal record. 3 have never been found since, but foul play is definitely an occurrence here. The Phantom Killer. The Phantom Killer, or the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, was the name given to a series of 4 total unsolved murders and related violent incidents in the Texarkana region of the United States in the early 1940s. They were all attributed to a single unidentified perpetrator nicknamed the Phantom of Texarkana, the Phantom Killer, and the Phantom Slayer. This hypothetical suspect is credited with attacking a total of 8 people in a 10-week period with a .22 rifle or .32 pistol. The attacks would only occur at night on weekends, and some occurred at Lover's Lanes types of areas or lone stretches of roads. And he was described as being 6 feet tall and wore a white mask often depicted as a bedsheet over his face with eye and mouth holes cut out of it. He was described as being white by some witnesses and black by others, and was written about as being clever or being just a step ahead of the police. Investigators would often nickname him the luckiest person to have never been seen, heard in time, or identified in any way. This panic and hysteria caused by the killer's actions and activity led to local stores selling out of things like guns, ammunition, and padlocks, and people in their hysteria would often board up and lock down their own homes at night while the local police would roam the roads to try to apprehend him. Due to the high-profile nature and the mass public outcry and panic over it, police investigated almost 400 suspects and received 9 false confessions from people who claimed to have been the Phantom, but their statements didn't agree whatsoever with the facts, and it's pretty clear that they did this for attention. The suspect list has too many to mention, ranging from locals, hitchhikers, war veterans with mysteriously missing rifles, German POWs, and unidentified suspects that led to people scratching their heads, and investigators without anyone to pin the blame on officially. This case is also known for the famous film, The Town Which Dreaded Sundown, which is a film simply detailing the events, which I recommend that you watch for this video. The Blackfriars Massacre. The Blackfriars Massacre refers to a 1978 massacre which occurred inside of the Blackfriars pub in downtown Boston, and is believed by police to be committed by either the Irish-American Mafia or the Italian-American Mafia. The attack ended up taking the lives of 5 total people, with John A. Kelly of Framingham, Massachusetts, the club manager, being found lying face down with 2 gunshot wounds in the head in a cramped, blood-splattered subterranean basement, along with the bodies of Charles Megorian, Peter Maroth, Freddie Del Vega, and the pub/club's owner, Vincent E. Salamont of Quincy, Massachusetts. The men had been killed while in the middle of a game of backgammon that had started up after the disco had closed for the night. If you don't know, backgammon being a board game in which 2 players move their pieces around 24 triangular points according to the throw of a dice, the winner being the first to remove all their pieces from the board. The bullet-ridden corpses were discovered by the janitor who had came in for work the next morning. The main theory is that all 5 men were ambushed at 2 in the morning and rushed downstairs into the basement, where one or more men executed them all with a shotgun and a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol. In the club, the police found almost 15 grand in cash and a stash of cocaine, marijuana, and illegal weapons. But they were all left behind, which meant that this wasn't for a robbery and may have been due to a gang activity-related scenario. The killings were allegedly over multiple kilograms of cocaine, and Vincent Sulamite, one of the victims, was known to have been a friend and associate of Stephen Flemmi, a member of the Winter Hill Gang. The Winter Hill Gang being a relatively small East Coast crime federation with an Irish and Italian-American background, which worked in notable crimes such as murder, robbery, drug trafficking, illegal gambling rings, and weapon trafficking. Due to the crime being organized so heavily with organized crime, the authorities have mainly blamed the crime families associated with the victims for it. They specifically went after the Winter Hill Gang and Robert Italiano and William Lorardi, which were concentrated on by the authorities during the first investigation, but they got dropped near immediately, and the other main suspect would die in a shootout at a failed shakedown in 1983. The crime has never been officially solved, but it is clear that organized crime must have been involved, and it seems to be a modern or more modern version of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre from the first year. The Gatton Murders. The Gatton Murders, also known as the Gatton Tragedy, the Gatton Mystery, or the Murphy Murders, is given to an infamous unsolved homicide which occurred 1.5 miles from the town of Gatton, Queensland Colony, Australia. The attack was on Michael Murphy and his 2 sisters, Honora Murphy and Teresa Murphy, and they were attacked between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. on either 26th or 27th of January 1898. They had returned home after the dance they were going to at the Gatton Hall was prematurely cancelled, and the 3 began the trip back to their house, but they never returned to it. They were discovered a mile from Gatton in the field, with Michael and Teresa Murphy being put back to back and both of them being heavily bludgeoned. Honora was found on a nearby spread rug 28 feet away, with both women having their hands bound and Michael being shot, with Honora being strangled to death. Police didn't arrive to the scene for days after, mainly because they simply thought it was a hoax until the brother of the siblings and a local officer, Daniel Murphy, pleaded for their investigation. Due to this massive failure, an autopsy had to be done by a local doctor rather than an official medical examiner. But the information he gave us was rather interesting and disturbing. First, he detailed the damage done earlier, but also added additional details such as both women being raped with a whip, Honora having a harness strap around her neck, and her brain being protruding out of her head due to how hard she was hit. These are to be taken with some salt due to both the amateur nature of autopsies and the fact that the bodies weren't contaminated due to police incompetence and the elements. Suspects tread on, with none being arrested despite the 5-month investigation. The failure of the police in this crime led to accusations of cover-ups and even rumors of apparent incestuous relationships between the family. But these claims are superficial at best. Despite the shock and outrage caused by this case, it hasn't been solved whatsoever, and the age of the case leads to no further investigation or evidence into it besides modern internet sleuthing and theorization. The Colonial Parkway Murders. The Colonial Parkway Murders were the serial murders of at least 8 people in the United States in the state of Virginia between 1986 and 1989. The killings were associated with the Colonial Parkway, a 22-mile-long thoroughfare that cuts through the Colonial National Historical Park and connects Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. Long stretches of the road are devoid of any streetlights and are extremely isolated, making it a popular lover's lane location frequented by young adults. In every incident, the couple would be inside their vehicle at one of these lovers' lanes and killed with a variety of means, such as strangulation, stabbing, and shooting. Also, in one case, the killer stole the victim's vehicle. Only 4 crimes have been 100% confirmed, with another couple going missing in the same area and 4 more crimes being loosely connected to the murder spree without conclusive evidence. but all had some inconsistencies, with the other murder, which leads to the deliberation on whether or not they were committed by the same person. A prime example is the murder of Lori Powell, who, unlike other victims, was murdered by herself, which the killer didn't tend to do often. In the local press, theories flew on the killer's identity, ranging from local security guards, local police, or even involvement from a rogue member of a local CIA installation. One of the main reasons that police were theorized to have been some of the killers was that at the first crime scene, Kathy Thomas's wallet was removed from her purse as if she was preparing to show her identification, and days after, the FBI had probably suggested to the family that her killer may be a law enforcement figure. Another victim's window was rolled down partially, and other victims had their wallets stolen from them. Suspects from the local Liberty Security were pretty loose, with most of them being loosely tied to the victims, and local private detective Ronald J. Little being labeled a suspect as well by the press, but ultimately he was dropped and deported from the United States on false immigration. The most important revelation in this case was that of Alan Wade Wilmer, who was nicknamed Pokey and worked as a fisherman nearby. He harvested clams and oysters, and later on started his own tree cutting company. But he also was an avid hunter and an archery champion in the area. He was known to confront people and couples in the Lover's Lane areas, and in 2024, police concluded that he was responsible for at least 2 other murders. But he died in 2017 and thus will never face justice for his crimes that have been linked to him. Even then, many spaces of this case remain unsolved and completely clouded in an aura of mystery and uncertainty, but thankfully, we are making steps to pull the veil down and get proper justice. The Eastbound Strangler. The Eastbound Strangler is an unidentified serial killer believed to be responsible for the murders of 4 women near Atlantic City, New Jersey in 2006. On November 20th that exact same year, 4 female bodies were found within a drainage dish filled partially with water behind the Golden Key Motel in the outskirts of Atlantic City, New Jersey. They were all sex workers and, as the name implies, were all strangled to death. All of the victims were all killed within a few weeks of each other, and the last 2 were only killed a few days apart. Some of the bodies were particularly decomposed, but it was pretty clear, due to how the bodies were so close to a business and how one of the victims had died just the night before, that they were dumped there the very night before. 41-year-old repairman Terry Olson was staying at the hotel because he was repairing parts of it in exchange for a free stay, yet was implicated by his girlfriend to be the killer, and when the investigators had searched his room, they had found several images of his girlfriend's daughter undressing. I hate it here. He was the only real suspect whose connection was thicker than a toothpick, but there's also a rather strange connection between these killings and the Gilgo Beach killings that I discussed in the previous video. That connection being that once they had arrested the suspect for the Gilgo Beach killings, they tried to get him on these killings as well. Despite this, it hasn't been proven yet, and rather has been disproved by prosecution as simple hearsay. The Honolulu Strangler. Also known as the Honolulu Rapist, the Honolulu Strangler was an unidentified serial killer who was believed to have murdered 5 women on Honolulu Island between 1985 and 1986, and is the second known active serial killer in Hawaii. His killing would involve him finding a younger woman at bus stops or other opportune areas and would attack them, binding their hands behind their back before raping them and strangling them to death, and leaving the bodies in or near small bodies of water like streams or lagoons. The killings quickly were connected and caught the police's interest, with the Honolulu police assembling a 27-man task force with help from the FBI and the Green River Task Force in order to track down the killer. He was identified as an opportunist who would not stalk his victims but rather find them out in the street, and his murders seemed rather unplanned and unpredicted. Following the murder and discovery of the final victim, Howard Gay was arrested on May 9th as a primary suspect of all 5 murders. His ex-wife and current girlfriend had described him as a smooth talker with an interest in bondage, specifically where he would bind his lover's hands behind their back and have sex with them. His current girlfriend would also state that when they would ever have fights, he would leave, and on these nights would come back in the middle of the night, and these dates would line up with those of the murders. He also was a mechanic on a local air freight carrier near one of the dumping sites. This seems rather concrete evidence, but he would be interrogated and fail a polygraph test and leave free. He remained free until he had died in 2003, and since his release, nobody has been labeled a suspect or arrested for these crimes. The Servant Girl Annihilator. The Servant Girl Annihilator, also known as the Midnight Assassin, was an unidentified American serial killer who preyed upon the city of Austin, Texas in 1984 and 1985. The sobriquet originated from the writer O. Henry. These series of 8 axe murders were referred to by contemporary sources as the Servant Girl murders. Most of the victims were black women, but one was a black man and the other 2 were white women. All of them were attacked while inside of their beds, and 5 were dragged out of the house after being attacked and finished off outside. 6 of the women had sharp objects inserted into their ears and posed very similarly. Eyewitnesses described the killer as very different people. Some described it as a yellow man using lamp black to hide his complexion. As for others, he was wearing rags or hats on his face to code his identity, and even one person would describe him as a man wearing a Mother Hubbard style of dress. Eyewitnesses also mentioned that the killer had either an accomplice or was even multiple people at the same time. 400 men ended up being arrested for the murders, but none were ended up being charged. In the African American community, and some voodoo practitioners believed it was a white man who turned himself invisible because no dogs in the area would wake their owners in the area by barking at them. And as someone who lives with dogs, I can say that this is actually pretty accurate for dogs to raise hell whenever something goes wrong, and particularly when something minor goes wrong, like the blade of grass looking the wrong way. The murders abruptly stopped at the start of 1886, and this is attributed to the increase in police presence and the rewards offered for help from civilians and for information. It is also believed that due to this, the killer had fled town to the police being on his ass and the heavy penalty for getting caught for murder back then, with a near immediate death penalty no matter if you killed 1 person or killed 50. The Lane Bryant murders. The Lane Bryant shooting was an incident of mass murder and armed robbery at a Lane Bryant clothing outlet in the Brookside Marketplace in Tinley Park, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago that occurred on the 2nd of February in 2008. The shooting resulted in 5 people being killed and a 6th person being injured. The shooting entailed the assailant taking 6 people into the back room of the store at gunpoint. One of the victims would then be sexually assaulted by the assailant. He was described by the surviving victims as a black man with a receding hairline styled in cornrows and a braid across the right side of his face. He used a Glock handgun chambered in .40 Smith & Wesson, and the murder started sometime before 10:45, when an emergency call came into police reporting the situation. The police found the bodies in the back and the only surviving witness, who the police have kept anonymous. The police would release a composite sketch and a memorial fund was made for the victims involved, and despite efforts, this case remains unsolved to this day with no major recent developments. This is an example of a case being obscure enough to where any articles or videos on it are either null or completely bare bones. This explains why this entry is rather bare bones. The Frog Boys. The Frog Boys were a group of 5 missing young boys who disappeared in Dago, North Gyeongsang Province, South Korea, on March 26th of 1991. Forgive my pronunciation. The boys were all friends and had been searching for salamander eggs in the western outskirts of Dago when they had disappeared. The disappearance caused a widespread media frenzy at the time, to the point where the police and military were ordered by the South Korean president himself, Roh Tae-woo, to hunt for the boys. He had sent almost 300,000 individual officers and soldiers to comb the countryside where the boys were last seen, and all of their fathers ended up ditching their jobs just to search for their missing children. Despite this monumental effort, it was not until 11 years later that the boys were found. Their remains were found among Mount Waryong, which was searched extensively during the initial search. The initial statement from the police were that they must have gotten lost in the woods, and due to this, they would die of hypothermia. But this didn't really make sense, since the boys' parents claimed that the boys knew the area well and the surrounding towns well as well, and that one of their bodies had unused bullets in his pocket. After their autopsies were eventually completed, their official cause of death for some of the boys was labeled as blunt force trauma, particularly from that of a farm tool. It also didn't really make much sense for them to be on that mountain in that particular spot they were found, since, okay, just guess how many times that they were searched for on this mountain in particular. No, you're wrong. They combed over the mountain 500 individual times, and in all those times, they didn't find anything. This leads to the theory and the thought that the boys must have died somewhere else and have simply been dumped there long after the search had died down. It took so long to find any of the bodies that there haven't been any official suspects, and the police are well at work to try and get justice for this, despite the fact that the odds are stacked against them. The Redhead Murders. The Redhead Murders, or the Bible Belt Strangler, is the media epithet used to refer to a series of unsolved homicides of redheaded females in the United States between October of 1978 and 1992, believed to have been committed by an unidentified male serial killer. The murders, believed to have been related, occurred in the states of Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The murders may have continued until 1992, but many of the victims themselves remain unidentified as well, but some have been identified, at a much later date. The bodies were all found dumped along major highways, and it seemed many of them were either ladies of the night or hitchhikers who met with an unfortunate fate at the hands of a serial killer. The secondary title of the Bible Belt Strangler comes from the fact that all the bodies were found within the U.S. Bible Belt, an area in the South where Christianity has a lot of influence over the area. Because of how the bodies were dumped along the highways with zero DNA or physical evidence on them, made it extremely hard for the police to get a suspect to stick. That was until the alleged killer made a pretty fatal mistake, being leaving a victim alive. In 1987, Jerry Leon Johns was convicted for the 1987 kidnapping and assault on Linda Shack. He had picked her up in Tennessee 2 months after the death of Tina Marie McKinney Farmer and bound her before strangling her and dumping her on I-40 before driving off and away from her. She would survive and give a vital testimony to lead to his arrest, but it wasn't until 2019, after he had died, that DNA evidence connected him to Farmer's murder back in 1984. It seemed pretty clear due to the similar MO, the victims being similar, for Shack also had red hair, and the fact that they all ended after John's arrest led to many, including me, feeling that the case is closed, but since most of the victims don't have a confirmed killer or connections, nothing is truly set in stone. The Gypsy Hill Killings. The Gypsy Hill Killings was a series of 5 homicides of young women and young girls in San Mateo County, California, during early 1976. The killer, referred to as the San Mateo Slasher, turned out to be both Rodney Halbor and Leon Seymour, and they were both convicted and sentenced in 2018. 2 of the victims seem to have been killed by Halbor, but that hasn't been 100% confirmed. Yeah, I don't know why this one is on the Iceberg. It's pretty much case closed, unless I'm missing something, but I don't want this video to come out next year, so sorry. The Tokyo Metropolitan Murders. The Tokyo Metropolitan Murders refers to an unsolved series of 10 murders of 10 people between 1968 and 1974 in Japan's greater Tokyo area. All of the murders and additional assaults were on young women and occurred specifically in the areas of Shiba, Saitama, and Tokyo, but the ones in Tokyo are the most known. The MO was that the killer would break into the victim's home at night and begin viciously attacking and raping them before they would inevitably die at around midnight, and he would set them on fire and burn the corpses before leaving. He seemingly wasn't very good at it for he left blood behind, but not enough to get a DNA sample, but enough to get his blood type, which is O negative. On September 12th of 1974, they got a suspect by the name of Etsuo Ono. He was a middle-aged construction worker who was initially arrested on suspicion of theft, but some parts of his past came to be very suspicious. He had repeated offenses, including arson and causing grievous bodily harm. The most alarming one was that he had once attempted to break into a young woman's apartment and rape her, but that ended up failing. His blood type was also O negative, which matched the serial killer's description, and he had been in the area with a pretty loose and dubious alibi. Because of the insane amount of evidence that lined up, whether circumstantial or not, and the media ran an absolute circus and riot with it, and stay with me here that a previous victim had identified him by nothing but his massive penis. Anyway, some things were not adding up. In certain cases, the blood found was not O negative, and this led to speculation on if the cases were even related. Also, Ono had claimed that he was threatened and forced into signing a fake confession by investigators. The torture he claimed, including being burned with cigarettes and forced to stick his face in his victim's mortuary tablets, and had his hair pulled out. At his 1986 trial, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but was given a retrial in 1991, with this one bringing forth his accusation of a false confession. He was acquitted for this and regarded as a hero by the same media who said that he was a lying devil and a silly criminal. Afterwards, he still went back to prison because of the prior theft, and in 1999 he was arrested again for yet another murder, where this time he actually did kill the girl. This crime was extremely similar to the previous murders, which makes it super suspect on if Ono really was innocent for them. This case is a pretty maddening one, and well, there's not really much else to say about it. The Marseille Bar Massacre. The Marseille Bar Massacre refers to the mass murder of 10 people in the Bar du Téléphone in Marseille, France, on the 3rd of October 1978. 3 armed gunmen entered the bar and shot everyone present in the head, with the sole survivor being the owner's wife, Nicole Leoni, who was in another room. The massacre was largely taken up by the French press at the time. The police thought the attack was part of a gang war between rival crime family gangsters Tony Zampa and Jacques Lama. The killings were compared to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and also is similar to the Blackfriars Massacre from last year. The case was going swimmingly until the presiding investigative judge over the case was assassinated by French Sicilian gangsters. After he was whacked, the case stopped and has remained unsolved since, with nobody being convicted for it, nor there being an examination outside of simple conjecture. I couldn't really find a whole lot in this case, despite the body count, and if you feel I missed anything, surely do to let me know. The Dardenne Family Murders. The Dardenne Family Murders, or the Dardenne Homicide, The Dardenne Family Murders. The Dardenne Family Murders, or the Dardenne Family Homicides, refer to the murders of the entire Dardenne family, who were all found by police on November 18th of 1987, beaten to death with a baseball bat inside of their trailer, besides the owner of the trailer and family father, Keith Dardenne. He was the mainly public suspect, but was eventually found outside the home in a nearby field, shot to death with his genitals being heavily mutilated. He had been killed an hour after the rest of the family. He seemingly got the better end of the rope despite this situation, for the rest of the family received a more brutal demise seemingly to get to him. His wife was pregnant at the time, and they had beaten her to the point where she had given birth. And they ended up beating the newborn to death as well. Keith's car was seemingly stolen and taken to a police station and dumped there, with the interior being covered in his own blood, which is theorized that there was where his genitals were mutilated. This murder occurred within a 2-year span of the area that 10 other murders were committed, and so this was the tipping point which sent the local residents into a frenzy, arming themselves and throwing around rumors of the murders being from Satanists. But the police eventually ruled this out, along with other causes and motives like drug dealings or infidelity. 30 detectives ended up working on this case and interviewed 100 people, none of which they could get anything on until the late 2000s, when serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells, following his death sentence conviction, claimed to have committed the crime. He was never charged due to the remaining family members denying his involvement and the authorities denying him leaving the state to assist in the investigation. This is a disturbing one, and to be honest, I'm glad it's over, but I'm sad that there isn't any closure nonetheless. The Saw Killer of Hanover. The Saw Killer of Hanover is the name of an unidentified German serial killer who is supposedly responsible for murdering and dismembering at least 4 women and 2 men whose body parts were found in Hanover and the surrounding area in the 1970s. None of the victims have been identified, and the case is also referred to as the Found Corpses of Hanover. The Soko Torso Unit of the Hanoverian Police, directed by Commissioner Gunter Noadius, investigated the murders at the time. A total of 13 separate body parts were found between 1975 and 1977, and they were found in multiple places, such as public parks, power plants, or dirt roads. The parts were all cut off with either a handsaw or a surgical saw, and the rest of the bodies the limbs belonged to were never recovered. Footnotes include that the cuts were very precise, but not that of someone with human analogical knowledge. The main theory is that the culprit has a background as a butcher. Another fact was that all the body parts were dropped off in public areas where it was almost as if the killer wanted them to be found, almost exhibitionistly. The fact that the killings all abruptly ended in 1977 leads to the theory that the killer died or moved town. But in 1999, almost 20 years later, another body was found in Isenbüttel. The body was a female torso, and it led to a former butcher's apprentice, Olaf Weinhardt, who had confessed to this murder and was convicted of other unrelated homicides. In Germany, again, another dismembered body was found in 2012, where the Masji killer, also known as rapper and Neo Did Not See, Sosh JM, had committed it, and since he was 25 at the time, there was no chance of him being behind the original 1970s murders. These surprising coincidences between the killings are highly suspect and definitely raise a few eyebrows. But despite the weird number of German serial killers and murderers that like to dismember people, any relation between the unsolved cases and the known ones is pretty dubious. The Teardrop Rapist. The Teardrop Rapist is a moniker for an unidentified rapist responsible for 35 sexual assaults on women, including minors, in Los Angeles, California. The assaults began in 1996 and continued through 2012. He's believed to be a lighter-toned Hispanic male whose name comes from the teardrop tattoo or multiple teardrop tattoos under his eye or eyes. He was also known to be described as being rather short, at about 5'4", and having brown hair and being between 40 and 55. He would usually go after women and young girls in their way home, to work, or to school. Yes, and I said to school and to work. He often attacked in the mornings between 5 and 8 a.m. rather than at night like other similar criminals, which leads to the fact that he has never been caught to be extremely bizarre. He would normally ask his victims for directions before pulling a knife or a handgun on them and ordering them off to where he would commit the crimes. He started in 1996, and his crimes would apparently end in 2005, but would again restart in 2011 when another teenage girl was raped by him and the DNA matched. He would fail another assault in 2012 when the police had enough and started a full-scale combing over of predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods in LA and offered a $50,000 reward for information related to his capture. The reward would double in 2013 with the help of the FBI. It was thought that he could have been Luis Vargas, who was convicted of 3 sexual assaults in 1998 and 1997, but whose conviction relied entirely on eyewitness accounts from his victims. He would maintain his innocence and push for his freedom through appeals until a DNA test on the original evidence had proved that he wasn't the culprit, and won the case in 2015 with nearly $1 million in compensation. This is the first incident or person on this iceberg that has no bodies to his name, but the evil presence and the amount of lives damaged or ruined by this person is undeniable, and the fact that justice has not been served yet is a degree of failure of our system and ourselves as a society. The Sleepy Hollow Killer. The Sleepy Hollow Killer is the name of an identified South African rapist and serial killer thought to have been responsible for the rapes and murders of at least 13 separate women, most likely sex workers, around... I'm not even going to pronounce that, I'm just putting it on the screen, fuck it. He also has 3 possible, but not confirmed, 2007 victims. He started in the 1990s and ended sometime before 2007, with his method being to rape his victims before strangling them to death with their own undergarments. All of the women's bodies were dumped along Highway N3, and most weren't, and some still aren't, identified to this day. The 3 suspected victims of 2007 were all found within the vicinity of the highway, and they were raped and killed in the same way, but the difference that makes them unconfirmed was that their bodies were severely burned after they were killed, and they were dumped behind public buildings rather than on the side of the road like the rest. Due to the previous killer not doing any of these, it seems that this may be the result of a copycat or simple coincidence. After this, the police would assemble a special task force that would hunt down the killer and use every little piece of evidence possible to get him behind bars. They got a 32-year-old man for allegedly murdering a 30-year-old woman near Howick. Her body was found in the nearby woods naked, with her hands and legs strapped together with a belt. She was allegedly raped, but that is still unconfirmed. Despite their original thoughts, they changed their minds on whether or not this killer was the Sleepy Hollow Killer, and declined any relation between them. Also, a fun fact, or not a fun fact, is I found no clear, reliable sources on where his name comes from. The February 9th Killer. Another thankfully solved case, Juan Antonio Aurelio Murillo was arrested in 2022 for the 2006 murders of Sonia Magia and her unborn child, along with the 2008 murder of Damiens Castillo. Both victims were strangled to death in their own apartments, and Sonia was also raped. They were both linked despite the difference in the cities that the crimes were committed in through DNA testing, and also despite the 2012 cold case classification. Juan was put into custody in 2018 for them, where he was extradited from Mexico after he was deported for fraud. He would plead guilty in 2023 and remains behind bars to this day. If any of my viewers right now live near Utah State Recreational Facility, please pay him a dear visit and call him the rightful title of not the February 9th Killer, but the Utah Piss Weasel. The Cheong North and Frankston Murders. The Cheong North and Frankston Murders, alternatively the Frankston and Cheong North serial killer, refers to the deaths of 6 girls and women who, in the period between May 1980 and October of 1981, were taken, murdered, and dumped in remote scrub in the Cheong North and Frankston areas southeast of Melbourne, Australia. This isn't to be confused with the Frankston serial killer who operated in the 1990s. The original 1980s murders and the topic of this entry entailed 2 murders in Frankston and 4 in Cheong North. All the victims were found naked off the side of the road, and the police theorized that they had tried to hitchhike or use public transport before they were abducted. There are more similarities with this case and the Truro murders in South Australia, whose suspect was apprehended in 1979, so there is definitely zero correlation there. Yeah, I don't know why they said it was. It is also theorized that the victims knew or trusted their perpetrator, meaning it could have been a community pillar or a law enforcement figure. None of the victims had a discernible cause of death, for the bodies lacked evidence and possessions around them. After making almost 2,000 interviews regarding the case, the police believed that it could be 2 or more people responsible rather than a singular person. The prime suspect was Harold Janman, who would give women lifts on the Frankston-Gyandyang Road. Despite how suspicious this was, he was charged until his death in 2020 at the age of 88. There is now a $1 million reward per victim for information related to the arrest or simply for closure. Dr. No. Yet another recently solved or nearly solved case. Dr. No, also known as the I-71 killer or the Ohio prostitute killer, is the nickname given to a suspected American serial killer thought to be responsible for the murders of at least 9 women and girls in Ohio between 1980 and 1990. Similar to other killers, Dr. No would choose prostitutes working at truck stops and parking lots along Interstate 71, and has other suspected killings in New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois between 1986 and 1987. Due to how all the killings were of people picked up along the interstate, it was theorized that it could have been a truck driver. He would often beat and strangle his victims, with his victims often dying after or during his murders. He would also often steal his victims' clothing as either a sexual thing or as trophies. One of his victims was also an infamous Jane Doe, being known as the Buckskin Girl, that wasn't identified until 2018, 37 years after she was murdered. This was where it would have ended, until they managed to link it to Samuel Legg in 2019 for the 1997 rape of a minor in Ohio. He was also the suspect in the murder of his own stepdaughter, but he was never charged for that, and the charges were eventually dropped. He is connected to 4 more murders in Ohio and Illinois as well, yet he hasn't been officially convicted because of his apparent unfittingness to stand trial before a jury. His next competency hearing is next year as of 2024, and I hope if he is the killer in these cases that we can get some justice for those that were lost. The sewer murders. The sewer murders, or sewage plant murders, were an unidentified series of murders of male adolescents in the Frankfurt-Rheinland area during the 1970s and 1980s in Germany. The killer's method was that he would get young men and tie them up, before sadistically beating them without mercy until they would die. The murders seemed sexually motivated, with some bodies having damage to the pelvic regions and signs of assault post-mortem. The murders seemed to be sexually motivated, with some bodies having damage to the pelvic region and signs of assault. The name comes from the fact that he would dump his victims in sewage systems, and some would sit in the murk for months or even years before they were eventually discovered, while others received a far worse discovery. Some bodies would travel down the sewage system before they would eventually make their way to a sewage processing plant, where they would get stuck in the screw pumps. Screw pumps being these huge screws meant for carving up and churning through solid sewage. This and the decomposition made it hard for the bodies to be identified, and the screws would give them horrible lacerations post-mortem and even severing certain parts of the body. Criminal psychologists suspected through analysis that the killer may be doing this through a disturbing form of sexual relief and fetish behavior. The throwing in the sewers may be a result of the killer being ashamed of or having pent-up hatred against gay people or for his own homosexuality. Horst Kropp and the AG-229 were entrusted with the investigation of sexually motivated murders of young people. For some time, a 40-year-old storeman from Offenbach, who was mainly convicted of multiple sexual misconducts towards minors and molestation incidents, had been the prime suspect. He was known for enticing homeless teens to his summer house in Riederwald, where he would perform sadistic sex games with them. He is said to have acted very brutally during these, but bribed his victims with money to keep quiet about what he had done to them. Investigators found out that the prime suspect and Marcus Hildebrandt, one of the victims, had visited the same gay bars in Frankfurt. However, this was not sufficient enough evidence, as the traces of blood found in the summer house did not match Hildenbrandt's. This led to 0 charges being filed and no culprit being arrested or officially listed to this day. The Doyle family murders. The Doyle family murders was a result of the infamous Glasgow ice cream wars in 1980 Scotland. To explain the insane thing I just said, the Glasgow ice cream wars were turf wars in the East End of Glasgow, Scotland in the 1980s between rival criminal organizations selling narcotics and stolen goods from ice cream vans. Van operators would often get into frequent acts of violence and intimidation on each other, the most notable example being the Doyle family murders. The reason this happened was many of these vendors will not just sell ice cream, but drugs and illegal items, like stolen goods, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, just imagine you pull up to the ice cream man on your street and you ask for a vanilla and just, on the side, a little bit of Coke for old time's sake. These conflicts were really serious despite the humor in the name, and they would often raid each other's vans and shoot their windshields out with shotguns in drive-by shootings. This would come to the head in the previously mentioned Doyle family murder. An ice cream man named Andrew Doyle, nicknamed Fat Boy, refused to distribute drugs on his route and paid the price, with him being shot on his route and his house being doused with petrol and lit on fire by an unknown group. That night, the entire family and 3 guests were inside of the house, including Andrew. 5 of them would eventually die, including Andrew. The public response was absolute outrage, with local police arresting several people for it over the next months, with 6 being charged, 4 being tried and convicted of other offenses, and 2 being convicted for the arson attack. Those convicted for the arson attack were Thomas Campbell and John Steele, who were convicted unanimously and put in prison for life. Campbell also was tried again for the shotgun attack on Andrew previously. This caused a 20-year-long legal hellhole by the suspects, whom did hunger strikes, breakout attempts, political pressure, beatings, and legal fights continuously until they would eventually get out of prison and have the charges being dropped in 2004. It's still unknown who the true suspect is. Charlie Chopoff. Charlie Chopoff is the pseudonym given to an unidentified American serial killer known to have killed 3 black children and 1 Puerto Rican child in Manhattan between 1972 and 1973. The assailant is also known to have attempted to murder 1 other child. Some of his other aliases include being called the Mad Barber or the Pied Piper of Manhattan. One of his main signatures that on his victims he would do or at least attempt severe genital mutilation, which is where the name comes from. He would stab his victims repeatedly and chop off their, He would also do these attacks on top of rooftops or other areas where it seemed like he would lure his victims to rather than hunt them down. The police got a suspect in 1974 by the name of Ernie Soto. After the botched abduction of another Puerto Rican boy on May 15th of 1975, he was arrested by the police while babbling a religious slogan. He had been an intermittent patient at the Manhattan State Hospital since 1968 and was described as an unemployed former drug addict. He confessed to one of the murders, and the only surviving victim described him as looking kind of like the killer, yet refused to positively identify him. His mental hospital stated that he had been in custody during the time of the slayings, but they confirmed he might have eluded confinement at that time. Despite the lack of evidence, investigators still believe he is a likely suspect since all the murders ended after his arrest, and an anonymous tip placed him as the potential culprit. His mental instability made it difficult for him to stand trial, but he is wrongly written in multiple works as Miguel Rivera due to it being a pseudonym used in the popular novel On the Track of Murder. The Morris Ford lynching. Alright, this is another heavy one, so hang tight. The Morris Ford lynchings, also known as the 1946 Georgia lynching, refers to the July 25th, 1946 murders of 4 young African Americans by a mob of white men. Tradition says that the murders were committed on Morris Ford Bridge in Walton and Oconee counties between Monroe and Watkinsville. But the 4 victims, 2 married couples, were shot and killed on a nearby dirt road. After the Second World War, lynchings in the South increased as many African American soldiers returned and were justifiably angry. They were treated as second-class citizens despite their service and would push for their own civil rights. This upset many white supremacist groups in the areas, and they would be responsible for 12 confirmed lynchings. This case in particular was when 2 couples were taken by a crowd of 15 to 20 total white men, whom were all heavily armed. They were being ordered around by a man in a very, very expensive suit. They were all tied up and dragged up to a large oak tree on a dirt road along the Appalachian River. They would then be fired upon in 3 point-blank volleys, hitting all 60 shots. This incident was nothing really special in itself, but there was some good that did come from it. It sparked massive civil rights protests in New York and Washington, D.C., which led to Harry S. Truman signing and creating the Presidential Committee on Civil Rights and introduced anti-lynching legislation. It also caused way more support from the white public for the growing civil rights movement, and the funeral received national coverage and attention. This case is yet another example of the horrors of bigotry and one of the incidents that powered the civil rights movement to where it is today, and the most disturbing part is the lack of justice for the victims involved, with no suspects being investigated or even named. Denver prostitute killer. The Denver prostitute killer was an unidentified American serial killer responsible for the murder of at least 17 women and girls in Denver and its various suburbs in 1975 and 1995. The killings were originally considered separate until 2008, when they were determined to be related and were all grouped together. The serial killer would choose victims between the ages of 15 and 25, most of whom were prostitutes and hitchhikers, and would take them from fast food restaurants and bars. The victims were taken in, raped, beaten, and strangled to death, and their bodies were dumped along Interstate 70. They were posed seemingly in humiliating ways, completely nude. Because the victims were dumped in ravines or in areas with harsh physical conditions and not found for weeks after, any physical evidence was extremely damaged and unusable. There were very few witnesses, but the ones we do have described the killer as a middle-aged white male. Since 2005, DNA has determined the most likely killer to be 52-year-old Billy Edwin Reed, who was arrested and charged with the 1989 murders of Linnell Williams and Lisa Kelly. Reed was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He is suspected of committing several more murders, including these murders we're talking about right now, but no evidence incriminating him for these has been located. Another possible suspect is Vincent Groves, a man linked to several murders in Denver almost 2 decades after he had died. According to the Denver Police Department, Groves could have been responsible for more than 20 murders of young women and girls in the area, around the same time frame when the prostitute killer was active in Denver. Despite the fact some of these murders have closure, most of them do not, so this case is still technically unsolved, and we don't even have enough proof that it was a single killer or multiple copycats or culprits working at the same time or together. The Skid Row Stabber. The Skid Row Stabber is an American serial killer who killed a total of 11 people with a knife between 1978 and 1979 at Skid Row, LA. Skid Row, if you don't know, is a neighborhood in LA that has been known since the 1930s for its massive density of homeless people. Right now, it holds nearly 4,500 homeless people. It is infamous for a long history of police raids, crime, and drug usage, and is one of the most notable and ugly parts of LA for simply how neglected it is by the state. One of the saddest facts is that the homeless population there regularly faces victimization, such as in this case, and the easily confused with Skid Row slasher from 4 years prior before these murders. In this case, the killer would choose homeless people or undesirables and would attack them with a knife and dump them off in alleyways. He would cause nearly 4 months of fear among the homeless population, with the killer attacking multiple victims a week and sometimes per day, and was so ballsy that some of his victims were killed in broad daylight at City Hall, in a crowd of people, yet he was still never identified. 3 friends of one of the first victims eventually came forward to describe the man as a 30-year-old black man who spoke with a Puerto Rican accent and introduced himself as Luther. He had apparently talked to them for a few minutes before he had killed their friend. The main suspect the police went after was Bobby Joe Maxwell, whose handprint was found on one of the victims, specifically the one that was murdered in the crowd of people I mentioned earlier. He was a 29-year-old black man who just got out of prison 2 years prior and moved to LA, spending most of his free time in Skid Row and being known for deviant behavior against homeless people. He particularly would harass them as they were sleeping, and more incriminating evidence like a knife on his person and the fact that when he was in jail no murders were committed led to suspicion of him growing. This, of course, led to his arrest on suspicion of murder in April of 1979. After this, his home and past were extensively searched and investigated, and it was determined that he was a Satanist and did the murders in search of souls for the devil. Only until 1984 did it finally occur, and Maxwell's cellmate at the time would be used as a witness. He described that Maxwell had not only described, but admitted to the murders in vicious and accurate detail, and this, along with the knife found matching the wounds on the victim, sealed the deal with Maxwell being convicted for 2 of the murders and sentenced to life imprisonment with 0 chance of parole. This sounds fine until you realize that there is no material evidence placed, and this was brought up in Maxwell's successful 2010 appeal, where his lawyers had proven that all witnesses couldn't positively identify him, and that most of them had lied along with his cellmate through either pressure from the prosecution or selfish interest. This led to his sentence being overturned, and he was given a retrial but fell into a coma in 2017 before he was given the not-guilty verdict in 2018, and he died the year after and wasn't even conscious to see it. The identity of the true stabber remains unknown, and this case seems almost more famous for its legal hellhole rather than the actual crimes committed and those lost. The 1998 Chechenian abductions. The 1998 abduction of foreign engineers took place when 4 United Kingdom-based specialists were seized by unidentified Chechen gunmen in Grozny, the capital of the unrecognized secessionist Chechen Republic of Ikaria. After more than 2 months in captivity, all 4 men were found brutally murdered, reportedly following a failed rescue attempt. The four men themselves were telephone communication specialists who were sent through a £183 million contract to establish telephone lines and a mobile phone network in the war-ravaged Republic of Icaria. The four men were kidnapped by 20 unidentified armed men after a firefight with one of their security guards. Speaking of, the reason only one of their security guards opened fire is because the others simply thought the shooting was random background noise, which apparently was so common in the area that no one really cared. The Republic of Icaria went after the kidnappers in a massive crackdown to the point where they found other unrelated kidnapping victims due to them hunting after known, infamous kidnapping groups. After 2 months, the kidnappers contacted the victims' employers, Granger, and demanded $10 million. On December 8th, the heads of all the abductees were found alongside the highway close to the border, in a sack. They were identified by their own bodyguards, and this damaged the public image of the Republic for good. There is evidence that the victims had an attempted rescue attempt performed, but it failed miserably, and the victims were all executed and beheaded because of it. This rescue attempt was criticized for ruining negotiations, and news agencies were publicly disclosing the operation was happening and thus ruined it. At the time, many of the area's warlords were blamed and under suspicion, and other accusations of Russian specially trained soldiers and political radicals doing it as a political stance or for other insidious means. One of the most messed up being the warlord R.B. Baryev, who had been accused of having his group kidnap and kill all the victims in this case and in other cases. Apparently in 2001, one of his former hostages claimed that he overheard Baryev talking about being paid $30 million to execute the victims by none other than Osama bin Laden. I rest my case. It's unknown who is responsible and if they are even alive still, and how powerful they may be. But this case is both disturbing and has horrible implications and repercussions. The Duckwalk Killer. The Duckwalk Killer was an unidentified spree killer who murdered at least 2 white men in the Rogers Park neighborhood in Chicago, Illinois in 2018. Both victims were shot in the head with a handgun at near point-blank range while they were either walking their dog home or walking home themselves. This caused the quiet residential community of Rogers Park to go into a state of panic. The police circulated surveillance footage and photos taken of the killer, and the killer's name comes from the fact that the way he walked, he would have a distinctive toes pointed outward gait. He was seen wearing black clothing and a ski mask. Ballistic evidence also showed the same gun was not only used in these 2 murders, but also in 2 other shootings in the west side of Chicago. There's an $150,000 reward for his arrest, and this is the largest reward ever fundraised for in the city of Chicago for a singular killer, but he remains at large to this day. The Frankfurt Slasher. The Frankfurt Slasher is the name given by the media to a possible serial killer who operated in and around the neighborhood of Frankfurt in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania from 1985 to 1990. He, or in this case they, have a total of 9 supposedly connected victims, and only 1 is confirmed to have been solved and connected to a certain Leonard Christopher. All the victims were between the ages of 28 and 70 and were all women that would be sexually assaulted before viciously stabbed to death. Several of his victims were also last seen with a middle-aged white man. During the investigation of the second-to-last victim, Carol Dowd, Leonard Christopher would become a suspect mainly due to him matching the description to a T, and thus would be convicted along with other evidence and given life in prison. Despite this, the final victims were murdered while he was still in prison, but the police ended up ruling that the last victim was a copycat killing, and that is where we stand today. The Wednesday Strangler. The Wednesday Strangler, or the Saga Woman Murders, is an unidentified Japanese serial killer responsible for the murders of 7 women in the Saga Prefecture from 1975 to 1989. The nickname comes from the fact that 6 of the victims disappeared on a Wednesday. Other common factors was they would often disappear during the evening or nightly hours. All the women were strangled, the women were violated beforehand, and near all of the victims had their clothing removed and stolen. 2 of the victims were found completely skeletonized, so a cause of death for them couldn't be determined, but that was because they were found years later in a septic tank and under a manhole, respectively. Another trend of the killer was that he would sometimes give the victims threatening letters or phone calls that would threaten their safety from a young-sounding man. In November of 2002, a 26-year-old man who had been detained for an unrelated crime admitted to 3 of the murders during a cognitive interview, but later recanted the confession. The suspect was charged with one of the murders and was later charged for the rest of them, And on October 22nd, the trial would begin, but in 2005, he was relieved of all the charges due to a lack of cohesive evidence and released. He would be fully and completely acquitted in 2007 despite the prosecution's use of new and cutting-edge DNA technology. This case is cited as an example of both poor police work and over-interrogation from investigators, and due to this, all murders are unsolved and there is no culprit despite their horrid nature. The Hassjärvi Gravel Pit Murders. The Hassjärvi Gravel Pit Murders were a series of 2 or more unsolved violent crimes in the 1990s that were connected to a gravel pit and its surrounding area in Hassjärvi municipality, approximately an hour north of Finland's capital, Helsinki. Forgive my pronunciation. The killer has been given the name Järvenpää serial killer by the Finnish media, and his method was to take his victims from places like railway stations and liquor stores. With them being intoxicated, he would offer them a ride in his car. He would then offer them drugs in his car while driving them to the aforementioned gravel pit. By the way, while he was driving, he was said to be using these drugs as well. There he would attack them with a knife, and in 2 cases was successful, and the other confirmed victim surviving. This is where most of the information comes from, and also the information for him using drugs heavily whilst driving and his loving of leather jackets. There's also additional cases of victims that have disappeared in the area and are unconfirmed to be related. He apparently has been last sighted in 2006, offering women rides, but has not been seen since. Though the NBI has apparently been investigating a lead, so there's a little bit of hope of it being solved. Itavia Flight 870. Itavia Flight 870 was a 1980 flight from Bologna to Palermo, Italy, of a McDonnell Douglas DC-9 class passenger plane which crashed into the Tyrrhenian Sea, killing all 81 on board. The crash is known in Italy as the Ustica Massacre, and it led to many subsequent investigations as well as legal actions and accusations. It continues to be a ripe source of controversy and conspiracy theories by the Italian government and its prime minister, who claimed it was a French missile that missed Libyan fighter planes and struck the plane midair instead. In 2023, almost 40 years later, it was claimed by the former Italian Prime Minister, Guillermo Armato, that it was an accident that got in the crossfire in a plan to shoot down the airplane of Gaddafi. Other theories are that it was a terrorist attack gone wrong, since the flight was delayed beforehand, and explains why it blew up midair rather than in an airport. Despite this, and the high body count along with the international involvement, there is no real answer to who or what parties are responsible for the plane crash, but it is very clear that foul play is involved and that we need answers for it. The Martin family. The Martin family of Portland, Oregon disappeared on December 7th of 1958 in the Columbia River Gorge during a day trip to gather greenery for Christmas decorations. 5 people disappeared in total, being the parents and 3 daughters, but the son of the family was in the Navy in New York at the time they had disappeared. 2 were confirmed dead, being the daughters Susan and Virginia, who had washed on the shore of the Columbia River 30 miles apart from each other. The initial belief was the family had driven their car into the river by accident, and that is how the bodies wound up in the river. Despite how simple this case is, there are a lot of theories ranging from escaped convicts being involved to their vehicle being sighted all the way in Montana. Despite this, the Martin family remains mostly missing, and I hope that we could find the remains of the rest of the family, and I hope that we could find a sense of closure for this case. The Oakland County Child Killer. The Oakland County Child Killer, or the OCCK, is the name given to the person or persons responsible for the serial killings of at least 4 children in Oakland County, Michigan between 1976 and 1977. Alternative names include the Babysitter Killer, the Babysitter, and the Snow Murderer. All the children were abducted on their way to or from their homes northwest of Detroit in Oakland County, Michigan. 2 were boys and the other girls. The boys were sexually assaulted before being killed. All the victims were strangled or shot to death, and they were disposed of in places where the bodies would almost certainly be found. The case led to what was at the time the largest search and mad manhunt in U.S. history. The case also had extensive coverage through local and national newspapers and radio stations. The killers themselves seemed to take care of the victims and hold them captive rather than kill them immediately, yet never held out any ransoms. Some had been treated very fairly and well fed and groomed post-mortem, while others were tortured and one had their face blown off with a shotgun rather than being strangled or smothered to death like the rest of them. There were also several other unconfirmed and even disproved victims. A few weeks after one of the victims was murdered, a letter arrived to the office of a local psychiatrist was claimed to be from a sadomasochistic slave of the serial killer, which was referred to in the letter as Frank. The slave wrote of how Frank was traumatized from the Vietnam War due to him having to kill children on orders and now took his revenge on children in the area. A meeting was arranged with this slave as to give him police protection and immunity from any charges, since he claimed to have participated and helped his master, but he never showed up and was never seen or heard from again. There are other claims to have gone nowhere as well, such as witnesses claiming to have seen John Wayne Gacy in the area during the final murder, and that local child molester Archibald Edward Sloan was involved despite zero evidence whatsoever, but it was found that in his car was 2 of the victims' hair follicles. Yet none of the hair in there was Sloan's. This implicates that someone he had lent his car to or knew was responsible for at least a few of the crimes. Despite the insanity of this case, it is still a tragedy and we should still treat it like one. So I do give out my dearest respects to any people who have been infected by this case. The Adelaide Family Murders. The Family Murders is the name given to a series of 5 murders in Australia, specifically to have been committed by a loosely connected group of individuals who claim to be known as the Family. This unknown group appears to have been involved with the kidnapping and subsequent sexual abuse of a number of teenage and young men, as well as the torture and murder of 5 young men between the ages of 14 and 25 in the 70s and 80s in Adelaide. The loose name comes from an interview with a police detective that claimed the police were taking action to break up the happy family. Bevan Spencer von Enum, a suspect in the Adelaide child abductions mentioned in the first video, was the only one to be arrested and convicted for one of these murders in 1984, and of 2 more in 1989, yet the rest of the murders don't have culprits. The police agree that the group is 12 or less people, and several of them were apparent high society members of Australian society. Another shared trait is that they all had a prior history of seeking out young men for sex. The name of this group has been called into question and even not recognized by some people and organizations because of how vague it is and the lack of evidence that there even was more than one person involved. This is where we stand today, with theories abound and very little answers to satisfy them. The Bear Brooks Murders. The Bear Brook Murders, also referred to as the Allenstown Four, are 4 female American murder victims, 2 of which being discovered in 1985 and 2 more in 2000, at Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, United States. All 4 of the victims were either partially or completely skeletonized. They are believed to have died between 1977 and 1981, respectively. The first 2 were found by a hunter in the woods, and they were both wrapped in plastic inside a 55-gallon oil drum near a burned-down building. The autopsy showed that they were both bludgeoned to death, and they were buried in the Allentown Cemetery. The second pair were also found within a 55-gallon drum in the same spot, and the times of death for both of them were about the same, and the cause of death was the same as well. The bodies of all these victims weren't identified for years due to their rough state, even though they were publicized all across the North Americas. Of course, with modern technology, they were able to find most of their identities and even found their main suspect in this case, Terry Peter Rasmussen. Terry Rasmussen was a suspected serial killer and convicted killer who was known as the Chameleon Killer or Bob Evans. He killed one of his girlfriends in 2002 and died in prison in 2010, but he also suspected of his previous girlfriend's murder and is convicted also on kidnapping her daughter and molesting and abandoning her throughout the early 80s. The connection to this unsolved case of serial killings was one of his victims was eventually identified as his own daughter from an unknown previous relationship. He, of course, was long dead after this discovery. Despite these discoveries, there is still no real conclusions to this case. The Alphabet Murders. The Alphabet Murders, also known as the Double Initial Murders, are an unsolved series of child murders which occurred between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York. All 3 victims were girls aged 10 to 11 whose surname began with the same letter as that of their first name. All the victims were sexually assaulted and murdered via strangulation by hand or with a cord. Witnesses also described the first victim running down the interstate naked while screaming, trying to flag down cars, as a van chased behind her and apparently dragged her in or led her back in. Side note, I don't know why you wouldn't stop to help a naked child being chased down by a car down a highway, but hey, I guess I'm just not that educated. She was, of course, found 2 days later in a gully not far from the same interstate she was seen on, dead. They also made an exclusive landline devoted to getting information and catching the killer. This landline led to a total of 800 confirmed suspects being interrogated, yet none going further than a single interrogation besides a few standouts. The second victim's uncle, Miguel Colon, is considered to be at least involved with her murder, for he bought a car very similar to the one seen chasing her down, and when they searched it, it was extensively cleaned with a strong cleaning solution, and one of her dolls was found within her uncle's car. He also relocated just 4 days after she was murdered to San Juan, but investigators weren't far behind and got him sent back to Rochester to be questioned. It was found he had a piss-poor alibi, but no actual physical evidence to nail him down. He also ended up ending himself after a domestic dispute with his wife and brother, where he ended up shooting them both. Another individual considered to be a strong suspect in the Alphabet murders is the 25-year-old Rochester firefighter by the name of Dennis Termini. Termini was a prolific serial offender known as the Garage Rapist, who is known to have committed a minimum of 14 rapes of teenage girls and young women between 1971 and 1973. He also was known to have owned a similar vehicle to the one described in the abductions. Another damning piece of evidence was 5 weeks after the final victim died, he tried to abduct a girl at gunpoint, but he left when she had screamed so loud that he was starting to get attention from nearby houses. He tried again shortly after, but when he got trapped by police in a corner, he took his own life. DNA shows that he wasn't involved in any of the previous murders, however, and it appears that this may just be unrelated. Another suspect was the hillside strangler Kenneth Blanqui, who killed 10 girls and young women between 1977 and 1978. He also lived and worked in the area at the time that the murders were committed. In 1975, he would move to LA and become the Hillside Strangler, but he is denied being responsible for the Alphabet murders. But similar to other suspects, he drove the same vehicle as the type being used by the abductor. As I said earlier, no one has been charged or even arrested for this case, despite how suspicious almost all of them are. The 1966 Indiana Dunes 3. This case was of a missing trifecta in the Indiana Dunes State Park of Indiana in 1966. All 3 were young women, and the most insane part was how they had disappeared near an insanely crowded area, being the local beach, which had almost 9,000 people in attendance at its peak in the afternoon. There's absolutely zero idea of where they went, and there wasn't a very involved search effort for them either. The women were described by eyewitnesses anywhere from swimming in the water late at night to getting on a boat before disappearing, leaving their belongings on the beach overnight. Most of the case revolves around the explanations, which mainly stay in elements of reality, but some do go off the rails and others are more likely than you may think. The first 2 we'll be discussing is that the girls simply drowned while swimming or in a boating accident. This seems straightforward and even a little hard to believe, but the beach they were at was connected to Lake Michigan, which is the Great Lake with the most drowning accidents. There are also a lot of boating accidents in the Great Lakes. Another theory was that they simply ran off and started their lives somewhere else, which would not make any sense since they had good relationships with their family and with their friends and were all doing fairly well with themselves. The most interesting and insane one was that the women were murdered by agents of Silas Jane of the Horse Syndicate. Silas Jane was a Chicago-based horse trader, trainer, and owner who was involved with criminal activity like murder, arson, fraud, and intimidation. He hired the murders of several people and covered up certain murders and arson attacks on his rivals. His criminal history and records are too much to count, but he is a suspect in this disappearance. The 3 missing were known to have been frequent customers at his brother's stables, and both him and his brother's cell numbers were written on notes in their belongings, and Silas later joked that he had 3 bodies under his house. The police would take this seriously, and before the sheriff was able to search Silas's house, the sheriff would die in an accident at a farm. This led to the case and its leads going cold, but after being asked about his worker's blue and white motorboat, which the victims were apparently seen on, it was destroyed in a accidental fire. Despite this, not even a body has been found, and there is zero evidence or even a set of bodies left for us, which is the most tragic element, that we can't even tell if they were murdered, died, or left. NA Flight 967. National Airlines Flight 967 was a Douglas DC-7B aircraft which disappeared over the Gulf of Mexico en route from Tampa, Florida to New Orleans, Louisiana on November 16th of 1959. All 42 on board were killed in the incident. The initial disappearance of the plane caused a near-instant response from the Coast Guard, which sent out rescue carriers which found bits of the plane as debris along the water and floating corpses along the Louisiana coast. 10 bodies of the 42 were found, and the main section of the plane was never discovered, though it is most likely to be at the bottom of the ocean. Analysis of the wreckage showed that the plane exploded after hitting the water, but later was argued that it may have done so in the air. The explosion is theorized to have come from a luggage bomb. The main theory was that a man named William Taylor boarded the flight with a ticket in the name of Robert Vernon Spears, who was a convicted criminal who he had befriended in prison, and police theorized that Spears convicted and manipulated Taylor to doing the bombing. After the incident, Spears disappeared until 1960, when he was arrested for unlawfully possessing Taylor's car and taking out his life insurance policy. There, however, is no proof of his involvement and that Taylor was even responsible. NA Flight 2511. This flight was a U.S. passenger flight from New York City to Miami. Mid-air on January 6th, it randomly detonated mid-air without any explanation whatsoever. This explosion occurred just a year after the 1959 NA Flight 267, which I mentioned earlier. This flight itself killed a total of 34 people, and the explosion appears to have been caused by a dynamite bomb, and the perpetrator was never discovered, meaning he could have escaped the flight or it was done as a suicide bombing. Similar to the previous case, the Coast Guard and the Navy went out and searched for the plane off the coast. After the brief cutoff from communications, and they eventually would find pieces of it over a total of 20 acres in the mainland, covering farmland, marshes, and forests. They found 32 of the dead bodies on the third day alone, and the last 2 were found both near the crash site and 60 miles away from it. Theories of foul play are abundant, such as that of the last body being of the suicide bomber itself. He was a parent lawyer named Julian Frank, whose body didn't match the rest. His body was extremely damaged, and damaged far more than the rest of the victims could possibly be. His legs were amputated, his fingers were burned, his stomach had severe punctures and gunpowder burns. The rest of his body was coated with metal and plastic punctures, lacerations, and fragments. He had previously been arrested for fraud, embezzling nearly $1 million from a series of charity scams. Other evidence was samples taken from both him and debris, which shows several common bomb-making components and even that of cell batteries. Despite the evidence and theories, nothing is fully set in stone, and I hope we can get a solution despite the age. The Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders. The Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders were a series of at least 7 unsolved homicides involving female hitchhikers that took place in Sonoma County and Santa Rosa in the North Bay area of California in 1972 and 1973. All of the victims were found nude in rural areas near steep embankments or in creek beds near roadsides. All the murders were of young women that were taken from Sonoma and Santa Rosa of the North Bay area and were, as the name implies, hitchhikers. You may have heard about this case from the documentary The Truth About Jim, which explores one of the main suspects, Jim Mordecai, who was a high school teacher who was suspected of being the killer, but no proof was detailed upon him. He was described in the documentary as a serial rapist of teenage girls, despite the fact he had 0 criminal record, and was also known to threaten violence towards them. After he died in 2008 of cancer, his family would find a box of jewelry commonly worn by teenage girls in the 1970s. They would throw this out, yet a DNA profile was done on him, but it hasn't been compared along with that of the other suspects. Other suspects I will go through quickly, but it includes the Zodiac Killer, Ted Bundy, Hillside Strangler, and Jack Boken. That's enough said about this one.